Accounting is a tool, and it's how you use it. But traditionally, it's been used for, for oppression or for control, for discipline, to the Foucauldian sense. And historically, this has been the case in terms of accounting and indigenous people, and with any colonial tool, which is accounting isn't a colonial tool.
This is In the Wake, a podcast by Intemperate Earth in collaboration with the Pacific Theological College in Suva, Fiji. Join Tim Breyer and myself, Arnie Psyche, as we dive into conversation with Glenn Finau in this episode, From Oppression to Resistance, Rethinking Accounting. Take it away, Tim.
Well, I was just going to say, Arnie, Alain Badiou, the French philosopher, of course, talks about capitalism as being worldless, and what he means by that is, it's not necessarily a homogenous US imposition, but it fits perfectly well with any culture. You can have capitalism with Asian values, African values, and why not Pacific values? But I guess today we're going to be talking more about culture and cultural practices and accounting as a form of resistance to capitalism. And to join us in this discussion today, our guest is Dr. Glenn Finau, Fijian academic currently based at the University of Tasmania. Glenn, Bulavinaka, and welcome to the show.
Bulavinaka Timenani, and thanks for having me.
You're welcome. Glenn, can you just briefly introduce yourself to the audience? Tell us a bit about yourself, where you're from, what you're currently up to.
Yeah, so my name is Glenn Finau, obviously, and I'm originally from Fiji. I was born and raised most of my life in Suva, around Suva. But originally I'm from, this is the tricky thing. It's like if you're an indigenous Fijian, you have to say like where you're from. If an indigenous Fijian asks me, Glenn, where you're from, I don't say where I was born. I don't say where I was raised most of my life. I say where I'm written to.
Yes.
Which is, as you know, during the early colonial period, the colonists, they came up with a land system in which most of the land in Fiji belongs to indigenous clans, which is a great system, right? And growing up in Fiji, we thought, oh, this is like how it is everywhere in the world. But when I came to Australia, as I grew up in education, I kind of knew, okay, it's not really like this. And when I came to Australia and how it is in, North America, etc., I realized, well, I think we indigenous Fijians are quite privileged and lucky and fortunate that the settlers or the rulers administration, they had set up this land system which preserved our land, and this ties into what I did my PhD on, which is accounting and land. Right, and so I looked at two case studies of Fiji and PNG, and PNG is another good example because they don't have a land system similar to ours as well. So, we have this system, and it's probably a system that we've taken for granted. It's probably a system that I haven't really appreciated until I left Fiji and I said, oh my gosh, look at what's happening in Australia. Look what's happening to the indigenous people here, right? Only then I realized, wow, and also doing my PhD, I'm just going to say this, but I didn't really know much. I was quite westernized, as you are when you grow up away from where you're traditionally from, and you grow up in the urban areas, and you're just exposed to TV all the time, and you grow up, going to a school where they just speak English. In fact, we were not allowed when we went to secondary. It was like everyone has to just speak English, right? And we were taught in English. I didn't really have a strong connection to my culture, which is something I really regret, that I had a lot of shame about growing up for a long time. But I'm really grateful that when I did my PhD, I was able to reconnect, learn more about my culture, not only just Fijian culture, but also Pacific cultures and just, the ways and practices of the land. So where am I from? As an indigenous Fijian, I have to say where I'm written to, and I'm from the island of Kambara in Laos. And Laos is an archipelago of islands that's in between Fiji and Tonga. And so my surname is actually Tongan, because back in the day, there was a lot of trade between Tongans and Fijians. And back in the day, there was no such thing as Fiji, it was just like, okay, this is our island, and so we are a mixture of Fijians, of Fiji, of Melanesian and Polynesian culture. Yeah, thank you.
And how did you end up in Tasmania? That's even further away, another island nation.
That's even further away. So it's all about the job market, right?
Yeah,
so I completed my PhD in 2020. It was COVID. It's a very bad time for academia in general. I had applied to a number of places. But one place I didn't want to go back to was USP, which is originally where I started my academic career, University of the South Pacific. And at
Yeah.
the time, there, as you know, Tim, I don't want to go into too much details. There was just too much politics and uncertainty. And I just thought, okay, maybe let me try and start a career here in Australia. And at the time, there were not that many universities that were hiring because there was a freeze because of COVID and the lack of students. So UTAS was, I never thought I'd go to Tasmania. In fact, I'd never been to Tasmania before I accepted the position. But you go where the jobs are, and that's how I ended up here.
Great. You've touched on a number of the topics that we'd love to talk to you about today around colonialism, colonial administration of land, and land tenure systems.
That's me. I'm very efficient.
So you touched on accounting, of course, which is your particular area and what you did your PhD in. And I think for most listeners, I mean, just again by way of background, part of the use of this podcast will be for people undergoing an academic course in ecological accounting through the Pacific Theological College. So for many of the students and listeners, this might be something new. And so for most of us, accounting is something that refers to, when we'd have to do our taxes once a year or something like that. And, I remember in I think it was about 2015, I was attending a conference on human rights in the Pacific. And I met Keith Dixon at the conference, who you know. And I said, oh, what are you doing here? What's your area? And he said accounting. And I kind of went, huh? What are you doing at a human rights conference then? So can you tell our listeners, how accounting is more than simply men in suits doing our taxes, and how perhaps it offers a frame for thinking and acting in the world?
Thanks for that. And so, mainstream accounting is all about, financial accounting, these practices that we have to comply with, whether we need to follow it, not to comply with government regulations, or if you're listed on the capital markets, on the stock exchange, these are the rules that you need to follow. But there's a certain group of academics back in, I think, the 1980s. They started saying, well, accounting can actually be more, right? Because accounting is a tool, it's a practice, and we need to account for things within the organization, account for resources, but we can also include other things as well. We can also try and account for the impacts to society and the impacts in the environment. So that really opened the scope and broadened out what accounting could be. So it's something that's not fixed, I would say, and it's something that we're constantly pushing the boundaries, because we want to move beyond the traditional ways of thinking about accounting and moving away from the capitalist ideology that underpins mainstream accounting. What the boundaries are, what the limits are, I don't know, but it's good to think about it.
Yeah. And so can you tell us a bit, accounting's not, I assume, just not a tool for good. It's not just, or maybe not even for good. It's just not is it a neutral tool, or have you seen accounting used in ways that, for example, are an exercise of power and authority over populations and communities?
Yeah, so I would say accounting is a tool, and it's how you use it. But traditionally, it's been used for oppression, or for control, for discipline, the Foucauldian sense. And historically, this has been the case in terms of accounting and indigenous people. And with any colonial tool, which is accounting isn't a colonial tool, right? It's all about the people who use it for their purposes, and also the people who are sort of being subjected to the use of this tool. And indigenous people back in the day, and probably also now, they're not that familiar with the tools of accounting, the practices, the technologies, the rules, and the regulation. But as we are bridging that gap, as more indigenous people are being more educated in it, they're knowing how to use it for their own purposes and knowing how to resist the way this tool is being used against them.
Is this, in one of your papers, you refer to the dark history of accounting. Is this
Yes.
Is this what you mean by that?
Yes. That's what I mean. Accounting and law, etc. How the different types of colonial administrations, they came in and they just took large swaths of land from indigenous people and then they justified it by using their legal contracts, and accounting tools were used to put a value on the land as well, and also the payment for the land. Even though that payment was paltry.
And So, I mean, if we think of Foucault, you mentioned him earlier, and he, you know, one of his main maxims is where there's power, there's resistance. So, you know, if there is this dark history of accounting being used as a tool of colonial power, in a general sense, and I know you've done research on this, and we'll get into your more specific research in a moment. But in a general sense, how have we seen Indigenous communities use accounting as a tool of resistance against power, against colonial power, and in what forms has this resistance taken? Like, how does accounting as a tool of resistance look? I guess might be the question.
You know, in many cases, this resistance is not solely being enacted by indigenous groups. It's with the help of other people who are interested in, you know, helping indigenous groups, and it's a collaboration, I have to say, because we need the people with the sort of the technical expertise, and also with certain levels of capital, which is, you know, Bourdieusian concept, to help those without capital, whether it be, you know, economic capital or the social capital, social networks, or even the cultural practice of knowing accounting. So I say a lot of this, the early forms of resistance was enabled and helped by non-indigenous people wanting to help indigenous people.
And can you give some examples from the past?
From the past, I mean, I think, well, a good example would be, let's say, in New Zealand, for instance, the Ngai Tahu clan, which is in South Island, you know, they were able to finalize. So they wanted to get their land back, and they wanted compensation for the land that was taken from them by the colonial administration. And you know, they were successful in a lawsuit, and I think they were able to get $170 million worth of compensation, and also land back. And there was a formal apology by the New Zealand government for this. And you know, accounting tools and technologies were embedded in that, and they worked with you know, Maori lawyers and white lawyers, etc., to be able to get that compensation back from the government. So I think that's an example. And you know, and if you look at other, you know, if you compare that to other cases, for example, in I think Canada, British Columbia, for instance, in 24, they got their land back. I forgot the name of the tribe. I think it's called the Chicoltan tribe of British Columbia, but they didn't get any compensation back. I have to do more research in that. But they got their land back. It was a large piece of area of land, and apparently in the court case, that was the first time that Canada had actually recognized native title. And I was quite surprised, because I thought Canada was a very progressive country. And when I found out, you know, in 2014, that was the first time they recognized native title land. And considering Australia, which is, they're not really looked, I thought they were like lower than Canada. You know, we had the Mabo case Australia had the Mabo case in 1992, and where they recognized native title land. But it took Canada that long to recognize native title land. You know, so these are some of the things that I'm still myself learning and understanding. It's quite amazing and shocking to me.
I mean, I do think that regarding the U.S., Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, I mean, I think, you know, these were the four countries that were most resistant to signing on to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Obama, you know, was in office, and so him being more progressive than your average U.S. president, I mean, he was more or less supportive, but certainly, you know, the U.S. has not yet ratified it. But yet, as Indigenous peoples are finding legal tools that can be used as normative international law, the colonial governments, you know, can't just sweep it under the rug anymore. You know, they, especially, you know, the white countries, you know, they have to be principled about international law. And they have to be a shining example of how the international order can be upheld, while at the same time industries that do not benefit from the UN drip, you know, are still able to reap their rewards. So they're stuck.
That raises an interesting question, Ani, about, and maybe either one of you can answer this, but is, again, in terms of resistance, or at least some kind of legal guidance or protection, is accounting recognized explicitly in any international law that Indigenous people can turn to, or is it something you have to read perhaps implicitly within it, whether it's the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People or something else? Is there any international law that people can turn to help in struggles that take on this form of accounting, for example?
I haven't read the the UNDRIP in detail, but I doubt there'd be anything there specifically related to accounting.
Yes. I don't remember anything in there about any kind of accounting protocols. And
What about in any other international law or documentation?
well, this is where I think this is where the UN Statistical Division comes in, and because the UN Statistical Division, as an international body, does govern over how countries account for, for populations, for for their environment, so forth and so on. I mean, the entire, the list of statistical factors. You think even when territories applied for state status, one of the things that they had to do was they had to list these statistical indicators into the statistical division.
So at that global level, then we could say that accounting still appears as this very technical administrative thing. It has no politics behind it, no history behind it. It's just something that you need to implement as a nation state. That's how it appears at the moment, right?
Maybe it appears that way, but I think there was always a very political reason for doing that, for countries to having to apply
yes, of course.
This stuff. So that's a fascinating question, and I've never really thought about it on those terms, and I think it's really worth investigating.
Let's talk a bit more about your research now, Glenn. The paper that we particularly were interested in was your one on accounting as resistance to land reform in Fiji, but I'm very happy that you, in your introduction, you mentioned that you also did some work on PNG during your PhD, so I'd be interested to hear about that as well. But on your work in Fiji, can you tell us a bit more about the context of your research and what you already mentioned a little bit about the land tenure system in Fiji. So tell us a bit about the context and what the proposed land reform was by the Bainimarama government that was being resisted.
It was just the proposal was just the increasing. Well, it was part of the I guess the trajectory of just the increasing commodification of resources within Fiji, and trying to bring these resources into the market. And one thing I had stated was that the Bainimarama government was very neoliberal in many of its policies. And the language that they used incorporated a lot of accounting language, like looking at how land had to be commodified and had to be commercialized. And so the land bank, which in its own name sounds like a very commercial and capitalism inspired term, was that. So the land bank, because previously with TLTB, usually the Native Land Trust Board, which is the authority that sort of like holds all the native land in trust, they're the intermediary between the landowners and any potential developers or any person who wants to lease a native land. And people saw that there were many criticisms of TLTB, its bureaucratic nature. It wasn't, both the landowners and developers didn't like a lot of things with it. NLTB, and so I think the land bank, which was going to be situated in the Ministry of Lands, was to try and address some of those shortfalls and drawbacks of the TLTB, which is they actively go out to landowners, they identify potential investment opportunities, so they say, okay, this land will be great for tourism, this land will be great for farming, this land would be great for mining, and they talk to the landowners and say, would you like to deposit your land into the land bank?
Right.
And then they market it. They work with like Fiji Investment Bureau, and they say, they go to investors. Investors who come in, we want to start a hotel in Fiji. Is there any great land? They say, okay, yeah, we have all this land. You look at our land bank, etc. Or we want to do a mining project, etc. Or they will actively look out for investors for potential projects. So Boa, which is the province, the actual land was, I think, Nawai Levu. That is the area that with the bauxite mine. They had, mineral resources department. They had, they had gone around Fiji and they had identified particular minerals in different places where gold is, etc. Well, they had identified that there was bauxite, which is the raw material that you need to create aluminium, was present in Bua. So I'm not sure who went out and looked for it, or whether investors came and said, okay, is there any place to do bauxite? I doubt anyone would just come to Fiji and say, is there any way we can do bauxite, right? Doesn't sound like something that we do. So maybe there was discussions with potential Chinese investors, because the company was primarily owned by, it looked like like its name was Zin for Aurum, but it was like registered in Australia, and he had Canadian, Australian, and Chinese. But most of the workers were Chinese. Most of the people there were Chinese anyway. Yeah, so they were the first lease to be issued under the land bank system. And I thought this was quite, when it happened at the time. So just some inside info. So my father was the former permanent secretary for the Ministry of Lands, and he was the director of mineral resources before that. So I had some inside information about these developments and the social capital that I had. So I was interested in it because I knew a lot about it when it started, and my father used to tell me a lot of stories about it, information about it. So I thought, okay, this is really interesting. And yeah, when I did my PhD, it wasn't in my, I didn't think about it as a case study, but when I, looked into, okay, what is the accounting angles? Yeah, I was able to find, okay, actually, there's quite a bit of accounting angles that I can use. Yeah. And so, yeah, I was fortunate that, I had that information and, things worked out, and I was able to write a nice story about it.
So tell us a bit more then about how accounting was used to promote neoliberal reform.
Yeah, so it was I mean, it
Go
was
ahead.
just the language that was used within the policies, the way they, and also they required that an audited financial statement had to be prepared by the trust that held the monies for the clan. So it gave a sense of legitimacy to the land reforms, like, oh yeah, we're being accountable, we're being transparent, etc. But when I did the interviews and with people, they said, well, none of the landowners actually did any of the financial reports. In fact, they had to get the mother, I think the Northern Provincial Council or the Northern some department there to actually help them prepare the financials. And no one actually used it. The reason why we do accounting is it helps to make decisions, right? But none of the landowners actually used it for decision-making purposes. And there was obviously a lot of activism against the bauxite mine because it did cause environmental degradation to that particular area. And people did feel, most of the activism came outside of the people who were actually, the clan that was actually benefiting the most from the mining company. So, they didn't feel there was a lot of accountability. There was a lot of engagement with the stakeholders, that some clans who didn't receive any financial benefits but were suffering the environmental damages needed to be compensated. So I think a lot of these issues weren't thought out that well. And yeah. So that was how accounting facilitated the land bank, which is what I argued in the paper.
Yeah.
And then I made the other argument that accounting was also used to resist the land bank.
Before we get into that, Arnie, did you want to ask anything at this stage?
I was wondering, like, what kind of enforcement mechanisms did the government have in order to protect themselves from, from spurious investments or investors or any other, the many kinds of dubious investments that will take more than they were accounted for. And and I guess here in the advanced economies, right? I mean, when you have accounting methods and structures, you always have enforcement mechanisms, and you have courts, and these agreements have places where you can settle disputes, like very 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 methodically. But in Fiji, or in the Pacific Islands, I don't really get a sense that there's a good system for enforcement. Hence a lot of
Yeah, so before the company was issued a mining license, there had to be a lot of due diligence that was done to evaluate the company in terms of its history, its background. The environmental impact assessment was conducted, although some people did argue that it wasn't. An environmental impact assessment, it's always hard, right, to account for everything. But also a bauxite mining is not as detrimental as other types of mining that are done in other Pacific. Like we have really bad cases in the Pacific, Octadian PNG, what happened in Nauru. The lease was only for, I think, 5 years to do the bauxite mining, and then there was another 20-year lease for rehabilitation. And during that, and there was also going to be no processing. That's also another factor that causes a lot of environmental degradation when the processing is done on site. So it was just extraction of the soil, which had the bauxite minerals in it, and it was going to be shipped to Australia for where it was actually going to be processed. And so 20 years was for the rehabilitation, and the Ministry of Lands and Mineral Resources Department and Environment offices would visit the bauxite mine every couple of months to review their environmental impacts, etc., and to see whether they were complying with those regulations. Also, they had to sign an environmental bond. They had to pay, I think, I forgot the amount, but it was a large sum of money that if they didn't comply with those issues and if there was environmental damages, that bond would not be returned to them. It would be used to actually, fix up all the issues so they had to rehabilitate the land back to what it was, and so forth. So these are some of the mechanisms which, in comparison to other countries, I'm not trying to justify this mining activity, but I think in comparison to other countries, I think Fiji again is very lucky because we're lucky we're not as rich as PNG in terms of mineral resources. PNG is, it's called the resource curse, right? And we don't have those level of resources, but we've also been able to learn from other countries and their experiences in the Pacific, and we also have good technical expertise, because you need technical people to be able to enforce this, do the environment impact assessment, and to review the environmental impact. And it's a good thing too. We had activists to fight for the rights of particular indigenous groups that were being affected but were not being compensated for this.
Yes.
One thing I was thinking about when you were talking about the land bank reform was it almost sounded like the old colonial positions of terra nullius, right? Like it sounded like government walking in saying, "Oh, look, that piece of land over there is empty. We could do something with that." Was there kind of an element of that going on? Do you think? Perhaps another way to ask this question would be, if we see an empty piece of land, how does an Indigenous person account for that versus the land bank? How do they compare?
Yeah, the previous government, they were just so focused on trying to increase economic activity and just thinking, okay, how can we, and this was the language that was used, right? Maximize the utilization of idle land. Idle land in Fiji. So it's like, wow, this is heaps of land. Like, we need to do something. What can we do with it? Let's do something with it. Talk to them. Find investors. Get stuff done.
But for the Indigenous person, idle land is not idle land.
Exactly. A more interesting example, which I probably would have wanted to write, but is the Namosi case.
Oh, yes, sure.
Yeah.
Tell us about Namosi. Why not?
Yeah,
that's gold mining. Is it gold mining there, or
gold and copper?
And copper, right?
Yeah, and there was an Australian company, Newcrest.
Yes.
Which is listed on the stock exchange. It's one of the largest mining companies in Australia. It's got a big presence as well in PNG, and they've been trying for years to get the landowners to sign off. And it would be a huge resource. At the time, I think it was 2012. They did a study, and they evaluated that the total value of, I think, gold and copper was it like 3 billion Australian dollars?
Wow.
Which at the time is the equivalent to Fiji's GDP, right?
Yeah.
So that's a lot of change. But the landowners, they to this day they resist, but to this day Newcrest is still there. Newcrest still has an office there, and they still have an exploration license. And they still believe that maybe one day that they'll sign, but they're deluded if they think that, because most people won't sign. They'll never sign, no matter how much money you throw at them. And I think that's great, right?
Yes.
Yeah, good one.
That in terms of accounting, it does feel as though we're at a place now where where activists or environmental advocacy is at such a place where we could begin to change accounting methodologies. And as you mentioned, when you're talking about the empty space or the space that people will just leave alone, because as we know, that probably has greater value than the destruction of that environment. So just as accounting, this is I guess when you begin to speak about the Berdosian's sort of approach, right? It is sort of where people can begin to sort of adopt the discourse of the hegemon and begin to apply that for their own sort of like preservation and their own progress.
Well, of course, there's the modern day or the emerging aqua nullius, I guess you could call it, right? Of the MPA, the Marine Protected Area, and the 30 for 30 or whatever it is that's coming into play. That we have to be careful of, I think, would you say?
For sure, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, I do think that that's a perfect example, when you're talking about accounting, that how it seems as though, for local populations or for indigenous peoples or for developing countries, that it would seem like, oh, this is a great benefit, because we're protecting, our environment. However, the data, which has a huge value in itself, that data will not belong to the people or to the countries. I mean, those are going to belong to the people who have established and who've invested and who literally manage, because manage is a new ownership, right? Who manage those protected areas. And so if indeed accounting methodologies begin to shift to adopt for environmental accounts, then what we're going to see is, another huge, gigantic theft of indigenous customary resources away from developing countries.
Yeah.
So let's get into the resistance then that took place in Bua in your research. Can you explain to us how the local communities were able to use accounting tools to resist the land reform, the land bank reform that the government proposed and was implementing?
So I sort of took a very broad definition of accounting. Yeah. So I how they used an audit report that was conducted by the Office of the Auditor General that had highlighted a number of discrepancies between, and also issues with the mining company. So this audit report was used in a letter by activists to try and bolster support for protesting against a petition against the mine, and then they took this petition up to the government, and this was presented at the parliamentary subcommittee meeting hearing, and I think it got nothing much happened after that, but I do know that when the same company tried to issue leases in other parts of Vanu level, that they didn't get the same level of support, because I think this is where they were becoming more aware, like, okay, there are issues with this, and we shouldn't just, like, for example, like I think Wainunu, for instance, in Bua as well, the chief there, well, the people there, they actually didn't want, and it caused conflicts, because apparently the chief wanted to sign the lease, but the people didn't want to sign the lease. And this is a good thing when you need 60% of the landowners to agree. You can't just get the chief. Like the chief can't. People think, oh, the chief's gonna sign off. Everything's, so let's go shower the chief with gifts and everything. But it's not like that in Fiji. In fact, if the chief does something against the people, then the people will go against the chief.
And so I think you also mentioned before something about communities had to fill out some paperwork or something around the accounting, and that they refused to do it. Was that what you're talking about?
They had to prepare, like, part of getting I think the second payment of the money was that they had to prepare a financial report of the trust account, because the money goes into the trust account and then gets distributed to the landowners. And it's not that they generally refused, but they didn't see the purpose of it. And so I forgot who did it, but it was like one administrative body within like the northern office, like Lambasa, who helped prepare those accounts. So again, it was just done. It was like a performative kind of function, rather than actually helping them understand this is how the money comes and this is how the money is being used.
But it does open up an interesting space of resistance, I guess. When we look at extractives, we tend to think of people chaining themselves to fences or to machinery or whatever in order to stop it from happening. But from your story, what I'm hearing is there could be this other space that people aren't aware of around the accounting that could be, used by activists to also undermine neoliberal reform and extraction. Would that be an accurate comment?
I mean, it is a much more subversive form of activism. And and if we could reach the point where people could look at, which would be really good if people can look at the financial reports and actually say, well, I don't like how much money is being allocated here. I don't like but we still haven't reached that particular level. Yeah? But the audit report was the first thing that was in the petition, and because there's a certain level of legitimacy when they say, oh, the audit said this, so it must be true, and so it can then again legitimize this resistance to the land bank.
And was there somebody working with the landowners that alerted them to this report and how they could use that?
I forgot who was the name of it was a member of the opposition party.
Okay.
And again, the opposition, they were trying to highlight the weaknesses, the issues with it, and say it's a failing of the government. And there was, it was also, I think, election. It was coming towards election, so they wanted to argue that the government was stealing people's lands or taking advantage of indigenous people, because the main opposition party were a mostly indigenous-led party, right? So these issues really, came to the fore at that point in time.
Anna, you have any question or comment here?
No, I mean, I think it's very exciting to see a situation where people have adopted the discourse of the hegemon to push forward their own protections and their own defense, and to be able to see that shows that I mean, here's is a perfect example of using something like accounting as a way of protecting rights and land and resources, and I think that we need to see more of that in the future. And so being able to look at this is as an example, I think is just very, very important. And I don't know of that many examples in the world where people have effectively utilized accounting as a resistance.
I mean, Glenn, you mentioned at the beginning that in the examples you've looked at where accounting has been used as a tool of resistance, that it's been supported from people from the outside. So if I'm a landowner now in the Pacific, or a community in the Pacific, and that's facing some kind of pressure for neoliberal reforms or extractive activities, who could I turn to help me think through it from an accounting perspective? Who could groups of landowners in the Pacific turn to use accounting as a tool of resistance?
I mean, I think they wouldn't necessarily think of using accounting as a tool of resistance, and generally they would go to advocacy groups, and groups would come and approach them. The church institutions are actually quite active in this particular space, but they don't necessarily use accounting. They just try and use their own networks, and they create protests to try and stop particular forms of development. But if they wanted, how could we use accounting? I mean, I put accounting up, I made accounting seem very important in the paper. But in the realities of things, if I was to advise, I would just say, organize protests or try and work with your government ministers to bring this issue to light, or work with media. Maybe accounting could be used in, again, legitimizing particular resistance movements in that way. But I don't think so in the traditional way that we think how accounting would be used.
Of course.
But if it's a legal action, then accounting would definitely be useful, because it would be useful in quantifying the legal claims, let's say, for compensation.
So they could call Glenn Finau, though.
Maybe.
This is the In the Wake podcast by Intemperate Earth. We'd like to thank our very special guest, Glenn Finau. Once again, we are your hosts, Arnie and Tim. Thank you for listening.